Hi everybody. We are going to spend another day talking about two-way tables. And so in our first situation here, we have a blank two-way table that we need to fill in with the information that's given to us. So it says, given the following information, complete the two-way table. A survey is conducted in the freshman class. The survey shows that A, 52 students have both a curfew and chore responsibilities. B, 62 students have at least chore responsibilities. C, 60 students have at least a curfew. And D, 4 students have neither a curfew nor chore responsibilities. So if you look at the blank table that's given to us, we can see that across the top we're talking about curfew versus no curfew. So our two columns are curfew and no curfew. Our two rows are chores and no chores, and then obviously we have our totals on the ends there. So if we go through and we fill in the numbers that are given to us, just to reread part A, when it says 52 students have both a curfew and chore responsibilities, that means I'm going to put 52 in the box that includes curfew and chores. Okay. For part B, it says 62 students have at least chore responsibilities. So when it says that, it means that 62 people for sure have to do chores, but may or may not have a curfew. And so that implies that that's our total for chores, which means we can fill in right away that we would know 10 do not have a curfew. For part C, it says that 60 students have at least a curfew. So similarly to part B, we know that 60 students have a curfew for sure, but may or may not have chores to do. So our total for the number of people that have a curfew is 60, which means that if 52 have a curfew and chores, 8 have a curfew without chores. And then lastly, 4 students have neither a curfew nor chore responsibilities. So that goes in no curfew and no chore. And the only thing left to fill in is our totals. So I can go across, 8 plus 4 is 12. And then I can see that the column for curfews, or no curfews, 10 plus 4 is 14. And if I did this correctly, both of my totals should come out to be the same number, which they do. We get 74. So how many students participated in the survey? That's our overall total of 74. Okay, so we're going to use that information to talk about relative frequencies. So it says, using the information from part 1, create a relative frequency table by row. Write the ratios of each value to the total in that row and include an estimation of each ratio to the nearest hundredth. Okay, so when they're talking about relative frequencies, they always have to tell you if you're looking at them by row or column, because the total that you use when you write your ratios depends on that. So remember, a ratio is really just a fraction, and it's like part over whole. And so since we're going to be doing these by row, I'm going to be looking at my row totals, which if I go back to my first table, were 62 and 12. Okay, so for the first row, I know that 52 out of 62 were required to do chores and had a curfew. And so that's my first ratio. So it's the number that was in that cell to begin with out of the row total, 52 out of 62. And it says that they want us to round these to the nearest hundredth. So if I were to type that in my calculator, 52 divided by 62, and I round that to the nearest hundredth, I should be getting 0.84. Okay, so then I do the next cell in that row. So there were 10 people who had chores but no curfew out of that same row total of 62. And again, if I figure that out as a decimal, I should be getting 0.16. Now, if I did this correctly, my row totals should always equal one whole. Okay, so if I add 0.84 and 0.16, I do actually get one whole, which is exactly what I wanted. Okay, so now we do the next row. We say, how many people had a curfew but no chores? We knew that from the previous table was 8, but now it's out of a different total because it's a different row. So the total for that row was 12. And 8 out of 12 to the nearest hundredth is 0.67. There were 4 people who had no curfew and no chores, so 4 out of 12, which is 0.33. And again, if I add those together, I get one whole. So I know I did that correctly. Okay, and then my last row, this deals with my totals. So my totals for curfew was 60 out of the overall total for that row of 74, which is about 0.81 if I divide that. And then here I have 14 had no curfew out of the 74, which gives me 0.19, which again adds to one whole. So when you're doing row totals, frequencies by row, your totals of your rows should always come out to be one whole. Okay, so then it says, what is the relative frequency of students that have chore responsibilities and a curfew to all students having chore responsibilities? Okay, so it's saying students that have chore responsibilities and a curfew. So how many people had chore responsibilities and a curfew? 52. And we're comparing that to all the students having chore responsibilities. And all the students that had chore responsibilities, that row total was 62. And so we've already figured this out from our table. It would be 0.84 or 84%. Okay, let's try the same thing but by column. Okay, so again, using the information from part 1, create a relative frequency table by column. Write the ratios of each value to the total in that column. Include an estimation of each ratio to the nearest hundredth. Okay, so again, we know all of our initial values, but now I'm not using the row total to write my ratio. I'm using the column total. So I knew from my very first table that this number was 52. But let me go back to that first table. Instead of making it 52 out of 62, now I have to do 52 out of 60 because 60 is the column total, and that's what we're doing. We're doing relative frequency by column. So this is going to be 52 out of 60, which if I divide that, gives me 0.87. Okay, and again, since we're doing columns, I'm going to go to the next one. So how many people had a curfew but no chores? That was 8, again, out of the column total, which was 60, to give me 13 hundredths. Okay, so now, how many people had no curfew but chores to do? So if I go back to my table, that is 10 out of my column total, which is 14. So this is 10 out of 14, which is 0.71. Okay, and then how many had no curfew and no chores? That was 4 out of 14, which is 0.29. Okay, and again, if I want to check and make sure I'm doing this right, 0.87 plus 0.13 is one whole. 0.71 plus 0.29 is also one whole. So I know I'm on the right track. So now to do our totals, we have to say, okay, well, back over here, our total was 62 out of 74 was our column total. So 62 out of 74, which as a decimal gives me 0.84. And then my other total was 12. Again, out of that column, 74, which is 0.16. And if I add those up, I get 1 whole. Okay, so this, just like the last one, if our columns are all adding up to be 1, we know we did this correctly. Okay, so the question here says, what is the relative frequency of students that neither have a curfew nor chore responsibilities to all students that do not have a curfew? Okay, so students that have neither curfew nor chore, we know that that is 4. And I want to know, how does that compare to all of the students that do not have a curfew? So all the students that do not have a curfew, which would be out of 14. That was my column total for no curfew, which gives me 0.29. Okay. All right, so let's do a second example here just to see how we do with it. So this one says, students were surveyed as to whether they have taken horseback riding lessons or tennis lessons. The results are displayed in the two-way table below. Complete the table. Okay, so this is kind of nice. They filled out really all the important cells for us. We just have to come up with the totals. So the total number of people that took tennis lessons is my row total, which is 45. The total number of people who did not take tennis lessons is also 45. The total number of people who took riding lessons, 13 plus 5 is 18. And the total number of people that did not take riding lessons, 32 plus 40 is 72. So now if I add my two totals together, they should come up to be the same, and they do. Okay, so part A, how many students participated in the survey? Well, that's our overall total of 90. What is the relative frequency of a student who took riding lessons and tennis lessons to all the students who have taken tennis lessons? Okay, so a student who took riding lessons and tennis lessons. So how many took both? 13. And I'm comparing that to all of the students who have taken tennis lessons, which is 45. And so that comes out to be 0.29. Part C, what is the relative frequency of a student who took neither riding lessons nor tennis lessons to all the students who have taken no riding lessons? Okay, so we're comparing how many took neither riding nor tennis, which would be 40. And we're comparing that to all the students who have taken no riding lessons, which is 72. And that comes out to be 0.56.
Okay, last part. Of the students not taking riding lessons, which is higher, the percentage of students that took tennis lessons or the percentage of students who did not take tennis lessons? So be careful of the wording for this one. It says right off the bat, of the students not taking riding lessons. So we already know that we're talking about the kids who do not take riding lessons. Of those kids, I need to compare how many of them took tennis lessons and how many did not. Okay, so looking at that first part, how many of the kids who do not take riding lessons take tennis lessons? And that would be 32 out of our total number of people who don't take riding lessons, which is 72. Okay, so that's our first relative frequency. And I'm comparing that to, of the students who aren't taking riding lessons, again, what percent did not take tennis lessons? So basically, the number of kids that take neither, which would be 40, again, out of the total who don't take riding lessons, which is 72. And that gives me 0.56. So which of those is higher? The percent who did not take tennis lessons is higher. Okay, great job.